Most dentists know that they should be building wealth. And on paper, it can certainly look like they are. They've got great income, super, maybe a few investments on the side. But deep down, there's this sense that it's really not working. There's this idea that maybe you're busy, you're earning, but progress feels really vague and freedom still feels super far away. It's not really a reflection of your work ethic. It's probably a sign that you are playing the wrong wealth game, because the game that most people are taught to play isn't designed for people like you. So in this episode, what I want to do is show you through the three parts of the wealth game, a clearer way to think about building wealth that actually fits the life of a dental practice owner. And once you understand the difference, you will never look at your finances the same way again. After more than 25 years as a chartered accountant, private investor, and wealth coach, I keep seeing the same things. High-income professionals doing all the right things but still falling short of freedom. So I started mapping out where things were going wrong, not just for my clients, but in my own life too. And what came out of that work was a different way to think about wealth, a model that I now call the three-part wealth game. It's really simple. But once you see it, it really changes how you allocate your time, energy, and your capital. See, for most dentists I meet, they're working really hard, like really hard. The practice demands everything, your energy, your attention, your leadership. So it's no surprise that when it comes to personal wealth, most of the time, there's not much left in the tank. And what I see again and again is this, that, dentists will put all their focus into their practice, revenue, team issues, patients, and that's where the noise is. And because of that, your own finances, the stuff that actually builds your freedom, ends up as a bit of an afterthought. And even if you've started building wealth outside the business, it's often, as I said, vague. A couple of investment properties, some super, shares, insurance, but no clear system, no sense of how these pieces come together to create the outcomes that you want. And then there's the outsourcing trap. You've probably been told just to keep doing what you're doing, that someone else will sort out the money stuff, the accountant, the planner, the portfolio manager. But here's the truth. No one is as close to your life as you are. No one cares about your money more than you do. And most financial plans, they're for products out there that are built for the masses. They're average products, average strategies for average people. They won't work for you. And the fear sitting underneath all of that is the thought that one day, after all the effort, all the hustle, the decades of work, you still might not be able to step away. And that's despite earning good money. You'll stay tethered because the wealth never really got built. So the flip side is super powerful. When you start playing the right wealth game, you stop spinning your wheels and you start seeing traction, not just more income, but real momentum, tangible progress towards something that actually gives you options. You make better decisions because you know what you're aiming for. You've got a clear lens to filter the noise, so you're not just reacting, and you're building, real building. And most importantly, you start to reclaim your time. So instead of pouring everything into the practice, you begin building life beyond it. And that's when freedom becomes real. When you work because you want to, not because you have to. And that is the goal. So let's talk about the game that most people never get taught. So I think a good starting point is to first of all explain what most people do when it comes to wealth building. So let's imagine that this is money and this is time. And when we first come into the workforce, we start work here. Most people understand that they should be building wealth. They should be building a pool of assets so that they can look after their future self and create some degree of financial stability. So we start here and we know the goal is to get to some point in the future where we've got this nice little nest egg. And let's imagine, just for the sake of keeping this nice and neat, that this represents retirement. Now, personally, I don't love the word retirement. It's a bit of a dirty word, but it represents that point in time where you no longer depend on active income. And, for some people, that could be 35, that could be 65, that could be 95, whatever that number means to you. Let's also imagine that as we enter the workforce, we start living our lives and we have these things that we call living expenses. And gradually those expenses grow over time. So, as with everyday life, they get higher and higher. Now, at the same time, we are prepared when we first start to tolerate a little bit of negative cash flow on those assets. And in fact, if we're using leverage or buying assets like real estate, often we have to tolerate quite a lot of negative cash flow. But the hope looks something like this. We hope that by the time we reach that point, which I'm calling retirement, happens, that the income stream coming off that pool of assets for that nest egg is at least equal to our living expenses. The dream, of course, is something more like this. The dream is that there is a positive gap between the living expenses that we have and the amount of income that our assets generated. Unfortunately, my experience is that the reality looks something more like this, where we've actually got a negative gap, meaning that our living expenses are greater than the income stream being generated from our pool of investments. And if you find yourself in the unfortunate situation that you have that negative cash flow gap, you have no choice but to start selling down those assets. Now, let's imagine that this represents death. Don't want to be grim, but let's say that represents death. And the hope for these people is that they at least have enough assets to sell down at a certain rate so that on their deathbeds they are, covered. They have their living expenses covered. The dream for these people is that they end up in a situation where effectively there is something left over. There is something for them to leave behind to their children or their community or charities that they care about. Unfortunately, for many people in this situation, the reality is here, and I'll call that dependency. And effectively, they end up in a situation where they don't have the assets to get them through to the finish line, and they end up either relying on the government or children or members of their community in order to live out their remaining years. Now, the worst part about all of this is we don't know when we're going to die, so this becomes an even more complex equation. But let's imagine that you are currently on the hope line. Let's imagine that you are on the hope line. If you are on the hope line, and provided you can keep your assets above this point in time, then even if your assets were to sort of tail off and perform not at such a high level in retirement, you would end up in a situation where effectively you have a pool of assets that's generating at least enough income to cover your living expenses. And I really want to drive this home. This is where true legacy lives. When you have a pool of assets that generate more income than it takes to live, and you have the capacity to leave behind income generating assets, you have a much higher probability of generating legitimate legacy. Now, let's actually look at this in a little bit more depth. Let's clean this up a little bit. Let's take out the dream, and let's say we are hopefully somewhere on, let's clean these off. Let's imagine that we are in a situation where we are sort of at this point in time, and we think we're tracking along nicely on the line of hope. We're hoping that at some point, in the near future, we are going to have those lines intersect. The question is, what if you don't want to live or don't want to work until you're 67 or 70 or beyond? As a lot of the dental statistics are showing, there are more and more dentists who are working beyond the age of 67. So let's imagine that you are here and you have some ambition. Let's say this is now. Let's say that this is somewhere like 5 to 10 years away. And you would like to work out, how am I going to approach my game of wealth? What is the strategy that I'm going to adopt in order to create an early exit, if you like? So what that requires is, if you are at this point in the cash flow game, so beyond active income, you're sitting around here. The game that you want to play is, how do you, in that space of time, change the trajectory of your income line? And so if we think in these terms, it becomes very clear that there are three components to our game plan. The first is, there is no avoiding, let me do it in green. There is no avoiding this piece here. You have to build capital. You have to cleverly use your surplus income to invest in assets that give you the highest probability of growing your capital. And that's where being clever about the sorts of assets that you use to invest in, whether it's property, shares, whatever it is, it's got to give you amplified results. So this portion of the game is really about part one is you do need to build capital. The problem is that most people believe that the only way to complete the game is to stay in that zone of constantly trying to build capital. But here's the nuance. And let me just make my highlight a little smaller here. I'll get rid of this for now. The second part, oops, let me do this properly. The second part of the game is this piece here. So this part of the game here, which I call part two, is really about changing your trajectory. And it's really about that active engagement in working out when it's the right time to start reallocating some of that precious capital that you have into assets that generate more of that predictable, sustainable cash flow. The third part of the game is really simple. Even after this point, if you kind of start to level off, you put a bit less effort. This part of the game here is really about just maintaining that passive income stream above your living expenses line. And this is what I call, oops, let me do that in purple. This is part three of the wealth building game, and I've called that building annuities. See, the reality is that most people don't understand that there are three potential parts of the game. They get locked into a strategy of never-ending capital growth, thinking that that is going to solve their problems. But unless your strategy is to eat the cow, meaning to sell down the nest egg and hope that it survives till you die, or hope that there's something left over, you will be caught in a game that's really difficult to win, and also which leaves you trapped on the never-ending treadmill of having to run your practice. So guys, this is a shift I call practice to portfolio. So it's not about stepping away from your practice tomorrow. It's about using the income that you earn because of your practice to quietly build a portfolio that actually gives you options. You keep doing the work you love, but on your terms. Because once you start playing the wealth game strategically, you're not just earning income, you're building freedom. And most people get trapped in part one. That is the trap. They confuse activity with progress. But unless you change the game you're playing, more effort doesn't necessarily get you any closer to freedom. And if you caught the last episode, you'll know I spoke about the 4 pillars of money freedom. Stewardship, how you care for money. Acuity, how good you are at choosing investments. Mindset, your relationship with money, how you feel about it. And knowledge, which is a function of learning and wisdom. These aren't just abstract ideas. They're the internal drivers that determine how well you play each stage of the wealth game. So think of it like this. Wealth freedom is the 3-part game multiplied by the 4 pillars. Without them, you can be in the right part of the game, but still stall. Maybe you've got good income, but if your stewardship is low, you leak cash. You might be building equity, but your investment decisions might be poor and you get poor returns. You might be reaching leverage, but if your mindset isn't dialed in, you will self-sabotage. So these pillars don't just support the game, they amplify it. And most dentists haven't been taught to measure or improve any of them. And that's the piece I want you to remember. Getting the strategy right does matter, but upgrading your internal game is what lets you apply that strategy effectively. It's not one or the other, it's both. When they start working together, that's when real freedom gets built. When these 4 pillars are strong, your progress accelerates. And if you're weak, it slows everything down. So if you're feeling stuck, if you're wondering why all the hard work isn't turning into the sort of freedom you want, this might be why. Maybe you're not playing the wrong game. Maybe you're just not playing the full game. And once you do, everything starts to shift. So the next episode is going to unpack a concept around what I call golden handcuffs and how to break free of them so that you can start folding time instead of fighting it. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next episode.